data in the COVID era, data reporting and accountability. I'm Catherine Atkin, a contributor to the Climate Data Policy Initiative and principal at Carbon Accountable. This conversation is co-hosted by the Climate Data Policy Initiative of Stanford's CodeX Center for Legal Informatics, with the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance at Stanford, and the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley Law. Before we get into today's conversation, let me first recognize that we are at a pivotal moment in history as a people and a planet. We are having this conversation today recognizing that we are witnessing the development of an historic anti-racist movement in the US and around the world. The call for enacting racial justice and addressing structural inequalities must be front and center of our work. Climate activists must recognize and address the reality that Black and Brown communities suffer disproportionately from the climate crisis because of racism and poverty. It is in this context that we will focus today's conversation on how to move towards a climate data accountability framework that can unlock the kind of inside and outside change strategy we need to address the climate crisis and the equity issues within it. The COVID crisis has laid bare the need for real-time, comprehensive, and publicly accessible data. Unfortunately, there remains a stubborn and significant gap between the actual emissions tracked and the total emissions from polluters, the climate accountability gap. Our panelists will explore how to fill this gap and why it's time to move beyond an approach emphasizing voluntary reporting to one focused on mandatory, transparent, and actionable carbon data. I'm joined by three people who have been engaging in the climate data and policy arena for many years, who have come together to map out some of the most important steps forward in creating a data-based climate accountability regime. Ken Alex is the Director of Project Climate at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley Law. Alicia Seiger is Managing Director for both the Stanford Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance and the Sustainability Finance Initiative. Michael Schmitz is Principal of Carbon Accountable and Project Lead of the Climate Data Policy Initiative at Stanford CodeX. We've decided to mix it up a bit today with the format. After Ken, Alicia, and Michael take some time to share their thoughts, each of the other two will also share thoughts and insight and ask follow-up questions of their fellow conversationalists. We're looking forward to the conversation. Ken, why don't you take it away?
Well, thanks, Catherine. Rather important subject, and here in 2020, a little bit surprising that we're still talking about what the actual baseline for data around carbon emissions is, and that we don't even feel confident that we know what those emissions are country by country, let alone company by company. So, there's a hierarchy of emissions and baselines. We can talk about federal governments at the country level, state and provincial governments, cities, counties, depending on what kind of jurisdiction breakdown there is by country, and then companies and corporations. Each of these has its own set of challenges and hurdles. It is really, given the profound nature of the difficulties and issues surrounding climate change, it's fairly astonishing that we cannot, with a huge set of certainty, say what each country's emissions are. We certainly can't say what each state is emitting, with some exceptions. And we don't know city by city or company by company, again, with some exceptions. There is a fair amount of reporting through the UN and through the CDP and other private reporting entities. But what I've been thinking about and doing some work on is how do we break away entirely from that type of reporting and think about baseline evaluations and determinations on a broader and international scale that we can then zoom down as we need to on particular sets of emissions. So one way to think about that, and where there's been a fair amount of progress, is through satellite data. One of the things that I was working on at the end of the Brown administration when I was part of that in California was to get launched a series of low orbit satellites that can actually detect point sources of emissions, including particularly focusing on methane emissions, but not exclusively. If we can get to the point where we understand the emissions from each jurisdiction and can do so remotely, then we get past one of the biggest hurdles, which is the set of political issues that may force or move a country to give information that is really not accurate about their overall emissions. For example, there have been some challenges to what China has reported as its countrywide emissions. And that's true of Russia and other countries, and may very well be true of the United States in some ways as well. Once we have that baseline data, then we get into a whole different set of conversations. And also we need to understand that that baseline data can come in various different forms. So it's one thing to have the total emissions from, say, the state of California. It's another to understand it sector by sector, to understand it GHG, particular greenhouse gas by particular greenhouse gas, company by company, location by location. And then we can start to think through, once we have various ways to understand and receive that data, we can make some very important decisions about where to spend our primary resources. So for example, methane is high in my list because it lasts in the atmosphere for a much shorter time. So if we remove it, if we stop emitting it and we control emissions from methane, in 12 to 15 years, a significant amount of that methane will be out of the atmosphere and will give us some more time. So I'm particularly interested in methane, but not exclusively. If we understand emissions from methane, it turns out, and we know this from some of the work in California, if you just take the top 50 or so point sources of methane in California, you get at close to what maybe 20% of point source emissions in the state. So that is an incredibly focused way to get at a lot of emissions quickly. If you can go after 50 sources, that's a heck of a lot better than going after 5,000. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we can learn, the sorts of analysis that are possible. I think it'll give us a much better understanding of how to spend our finite resources and really make progress more quickly. And you can see that potentially replicated across different greenhouse gases, potentially, and certainly jurisdiction by jurisdiction, which is how I've been thinking about it. We might also be able to think about it across corporations and companies, depending on the segment of the economy. Obviously, oil and gas comes to mind, but there may be other obvious sources of emissions. That's a particular type of emissions that's easily identifiable as a point source. That's not everything that we need to figure out because there are plenty of emissions that don't come across as point sources. And so we need to look at those in a more jurisdictional kind of way. There's a lot to think about, but the basic point that I started with and I want to get back to is that it really is troubling that we do not at this point have the basic baseline data that we find to be reliable and that we can make really important decisions for policy and investment. And hopefully that's something that we can overcome in the near future. So
Thanks.
I'm forgetting if I'm supposed to do the transition and
Well,
go
that's
to Catherine.
fantastic. We really appreciate those insights and sharing a provocative vision of a global solution. So Alicia, Michael, reactions and questions for Ken?
Yeah, sure. Ken, thank you. That was great. I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you want to batch them or I can parse them out, but
We'll see about my memory.
all right. So, I mean, a couple of things, lots of stuff came to mind as you're talking, but I'll spare you multiple questions at once. But so first is I was struck by during COVID already, we've seen some reports about calculations for emissions reductions during this period of sheltering in place across all the major emitting countries. I've seen there's an article published in Nature Climate Change that calculated a 17% reduction over that most profound period. I'm curious what's underlying that in terms of the sources of information, the use of satellites and sensors to achieve that analysis. Is that sufficient? Is that an example of what you're talking about, or is that still suboptimal? And if so, how and why? And then also, what you see are the biggest barriers to actually realizing this vision? Is it what's getting in the way of what I share to be your sort of astonishment in terms of something we need so clearly that is yet to be?
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways at this data. So for example, and you have to kind of put it all together. So one of the things that I find fascinating is that entities like Google believe, and this makes a lot of sense, that they can figure out a lot of about transportation emissions just by using Android data. Mm-hmm. So they can to spin that out a ways, they can use information about how their people are using phones. They can track the transportation through where the phone is going, and then use an average amount of emissions for those travels. And then you can tie that together with some of the satellite data from Landsat and some other sources. And you can imagine really building out a pretty substantial amount of data. My guess on the 17% emission, I also read that. A lot of that was around transportation. That information is fairly cognizable, at least on the broad spectrum. And there's fairly good data around large-scale industrial emissions. And that's for sure true in places like California and much of the US and Europe. A fair amount of information is available more broadly. And if you're just kind of making an estimate of the type of reduction that we're seeing, I think that you can make a pretty good estimate. But to get kind of more into the detail is where we have to go. The barriers are not insubstantial, as always. To give you a sense that it's not, crazy. The methane satellite project that we've been working on to look at point sources around the world, it's been work we started with Planet Labs in San Francisco, with JPL. Bloomberg is quite involved, Grantham Foundation, Overlook. To put about 16 satellites into orbit, these are low orbit satellites the size of a bread box, kind of amazing. It's not $1 billion, it's tens of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And so, to have that capacity at that scale for that price, given the set of issues that we have, why isn't the federal government funding this? Why, it's the state of California working on it in conjunction with private philanthropy, basically. I believe
Dr. Brown had his own expression for that, right?
Yeah, he wanted his own damn satellite. And there are other efforts around this. EDF Environmental Defense Fund is working on a satellite that actually will work nicely with these low orbit satellites. It looks less at point sources and more at a larger region of emissions. And so, it's not an outrageous amount of money to do that. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is, getting some of the data, terrestrial data, like I mentioned with the Android data, other sources of data, and then compiling all that, putting it together in a form that is transparent and that people can analyze and use. And that actually is no small piece of it. But there are, some interesting platforms. WRI, World Resources Institute, has a really interesting platform to make data available. All of this can be done, at a comparatively modest price and scale, but it, needs some entities like the United States to really back it, and obviously that's not where we are at the moment.
Ken, I'd love to follow up and because you used to wear a hat where you essentially would wrangle and persuade and engage with diplomats from all over the world at every level. And from your perspective, the jurisdictional and let's name it political challenges are probably, whether they're more substantial or not, they're certainly significant. When I think about the idea of satellite data capturing kind of global emissions of a global gas, how do you see the jurisdictional political challenges? Because, for instance, your reference to the data that was captured in the case of in Beijing by the U.S. Embassy when they started capturing PM 2.5 and PM 10 data, it was instantly it was something that was quite politically sensitive and yet instantly taken up by everybody who saw it. So I think those kind of examples of kind of political data sensitivities and how to engage and overcome those things, I think are really important. How do we do that, Ken? Are you gonna maybe hop back out there and do it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, but I think the part of the answer is getting the satellites in place and then having the data. There are rules and countries may very well object, and you'll have to kind of work that through. That may become a United Nations function, and there will need to be leadership from countries like the United States and the European Union to say, we're going to be leaders and provide this data. We want it to be accurate. We want it to be public. And I think that will have a pretty substantial impact. The countries that don't want that data to be made public will need to explain why, and there'll be pressure on them to provide it. And under the Paris Agreement, everybody in theory does have to report their emissions, and this will be a way to do it. And if you're not doing it, then your reporting of your own emissions should be suspect.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken. That was really just, I shouldn't use the tip of the iceberg as an image, but there's a lot there, forgive me. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for that conversation. And now we get to keep going, and we're going to hear from Alicia now, is going to share some of her thoughts, and then we'll kind of get under the hood as well with her.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to take kind of a broader approach here in my opening remarks and just sort of frame the conversation slightly differently. So just quickly, a little bit my background. So I work on solutions at the intersection of climate change and capital markets. My background is as an entrepreneur, building early stage ventures at emerging sectors of the economy. Most notably, I helped lead TerraPass, one of the first US voluntary carbon offset companies, which has some relevance to the conversation we're having today. And Catherine, I just want to say I really appreciated your comments in your opening remarks. I have been doing a lot more listening and learning to becoming a better ally in the fight for racial and climate justice. And as I think we all new and are increasingly aware they are one and the same. So let me just start by framing climate with a brief look back of its history in 20-year increments. I promise this will be brief. So in the period starting in the 1980s, I think we can think of that 20-year period as the question of the science, right? We were looking at whether or not the science was real or not. And we finally settled that debate despite some actors' best attempts to dispel and manufacture doubt. Mm-hmm. And then in the 2000s, it really became a question of, but what about the economics? Is it going to be, how much more is it going to cost to build green than brown? And again, I think we've settled that debate with the plummeting prices of wind and solar and storage and EV. It's just cheaper to build green in many sectors, and with innovation and research and development, the goal is to make that across the board. And now in the beginning of the 2020s, I think we can see perhaps this next 20-year period as a question of finance. This question of how do we price the risks of climate change, who pays for them, and what do we do about stranded assets? And for all of those chapters, but this chapter especially, we need data. And now, layered on top of this, we have COVID. We have a global pandemic. And like climate change, COVID was a case in poor risk management. So we knew the risks were out there. We had a pretty good sense of the potentially catastrophic effects. And we did very little to invest in preparation. The analogy is striking and unsettling. And where we find ourselves now with the COVID situation, there's still lots of speculation. We don't really know. There's still a lot we don't know. We still are seeking treatments. We're still trying to understand transmission. We don't know what the world is going to look like in the next 6 to 12 months, 18 or 24 months even. We don't know what changes are going to be permanent and what are temporary. But I would say we've already learned some important lessons, and I just want to list 5 that I think are important that apply to both COVID and climate. So first is that science can be more powerful than politics, religion, and greed. So, as we saw in many states as the crisis peaked, political rallies, churches, mosques, temples, and factories, they were all closed because the scientists told us to. And so the takeaway here, of course, is that when scientists warn us about climate change, we must take those warnings seriously. The second lesson is that abrupt and disorderly economic and societal transitions hurt the most vulnerable most. So COVID and climate exacerbate existing inequality and inequity. They're not fair. Climate justice, like COVID-19, is racial justice. If we do nothing, Black communities in the US and low-income communities around the world will be hit hardest. Mm-hmm. The third lesson is that individual behavior changes can make a difference, but decision-making by governments and businesses and investors matters most. So as we talked about earlier with Ken's comments, even with most of the world in lockdown, we still saw at the peak 17% emissions reductions. The forecasts are about a 7.5% drop on the year, but that's still barely. It's about the emissions reductions target for a 2030 track to stay within 1.5 degrees C. But let's remember these drops are only temporary and aren't expected to have a material impact on future carbon emissions. The fourth lesson is that, and this was particularly striking, governments can mobilize trillions of dollars in a matter of days when lives and livelihoods are on the line. So we saw Congress pass the $2.2 trillion CARES Act in just a few weeks after the virus emerged as a domestic threat. And just to put that into context, the CARES Act alone exceeds the price tags of most of the most ambitious national climate policy proposals. And the COVID stimulus so far already exceeds what was on offer in the 3-year period following the 2008 financial crisis. And then finally, and most relevant for today's discussion, that policies are only as good as the data on which they are based. So collecting, verifying, and managing best-in-class data are imperatives. This is true for both climate and COVID. So we're here to talk about data, and just like data is helping scientists figure out treatments and tactics for managing COVID-19, improving data collection and management will be absolutely critical to addressing climate change. And there are lots of applications for data in pursuit of climate goals. Ken was just talking mostly about emissions data to get a sense for what's really going on, sort of a real-time scoreboard to hold businesses and governments accountable, and that is absolutely critical. I'm more focused on climate-related data in the context of risk and opportunity and how that data plays a role in helping governments and businesses mitigate those risks and capitalize on those opportunities, and for investors and NGOs to hold them accountable to targets, with the ultimate goal, of course, of shifting capital at scale towards investment in climate opportunities and climate resilience. So before I go further, I just want to level set on what I'm talking about when I talk about climate risk data for businesses and investors. I'm not talking about the E in ESG, and I'm not even talking about ESG data. I'm of the mind that ESG has a trilateral equivalency problem. E does not equal S, does not equal G. A case in point of this are three more letters, P, G, and E. So PG and E had a strong ESG ratings, but as many of us know, probably most on this webinar, PG&E was the first climate bankruptcy. They're not the same thing. So climate risk is about the transition and physical risks of climate, transition being the risks associated as enterprises and economies shift from high to low carbon intensity and low to high climate resilience. And the physical risk being the impact of chronic and acute weather changes that have an effect on physical assets, supply chains, worker productivity, human health, et cetera. All these aspects affect core operations and should be managed as a core business function. So let me just give some examples of where the more obvious sources of emissions and the kinds of climate risks I'm talking about might diverge. So to the extent it's thought about, I think people are most familiar with stranded assets as a climate risk, and that's kind of the overlapping area of the Venn diagram. But as we move out into this portion of the Venn diagram that's really more about climate risk and less about emissions data per se, you can look at things like real estate, where you'll start to see 30-year mortgages as an instrument of the past. So to home insurance, muni bonds, the risk of default is increasing as the risks of municipalities from climate impacts exceeds adaptive capacity. In things like travel and leisure, where there are going to be many days in Florida where it's just too hot for kids to be walking around Disney World all day, let alone for an adult to be wearing a big fuzzy suit. Skiing, ski resorts are facing significant exposure. Food and ag, you're going to see large cattle operations replaced with plant protein and regenerative agriculture. Retail, winter is out. And for internal combustion engines, you're seeing the end of their breed. So just to conclude my opening salvo, I thought I'd offer 5 points about how improved data collection and management can have a material impact on climate. So first, data quality. We have to move from self-reported, highly variable, non-standardized, non-comparable data to audited, mandatory, standardized, and comparable data sets. This is critical for corporate disclosures in particular, so investors can make more informed decisions. And this also rolls up into my second point, which is stress tests. So this came up earlier in terms of what the US is doing versus the rest of the world. I mean, what we're seeing now already is that central banks in Europe and Asia are already mandating stress tests for financial institutions. And I think it's safe to say these first passes are modest, the models are crude, but the tests are surfacing previously undetected systemic risks to the financial system of national governments. And done well, I think these tests can accelerate the end of things like commercial and government lending to carbon intensive sectors and things like fossil fuel subsidies. And then it's important to remember that these tests and the TCFD reporting that will enable them, they need to become mandatory, but in reality, it may not matter as much what happens in the US because the global nature of the financial services industry means that mandates in Europe and Asia effectively force the hands of most major financial institutions because they're doing business in these markets anyway. The third point is that we need better models. So we need to get much more sophisticated on climate risk modeling. Rather than running equilibrium models, we need to be developing the ability to incorporate feedback loops and path dependencies, tipping points, and to be able to combine physical and transition risks. Fourth, we need better green taxonomies. So we have to get smart on what's green and what's greenwashing or just stasis. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we need better and more verification and auditing, and this gets back to Ken's point too, and this has to be across the board. So especially with respect to what I see as a rapidly expanding new carbon offset market, and that in support of the trend towards carbon negative pledges, and in particular with respect to measurement and verification of natural carbon sinks, soil sequestration, and afforestation. So I'll leave it at that for my opening salvo, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Alicia. That is a lot of food for thought there. Mike and Ken, thoughts, questions?
So I have many questions for you, and I will stick with a couple of them. So one thing that occurs to me is that in theory, insurance should be a way to kind of incorporate the risk that you're identifying, and that industry should be really out front in wanting this kind of data. I guess my observation is that as an industry, it has not been. And my first question is, do you have, if you agree with that, do you have a sense of why and how we change that? And then my second question is, you really made a very big and I think important point that we have to have much greater corporate disclosure around climate risk. And I wonder if you've seen any examples anywhere of legislation or initiatives that get at a better level and appropriate set of requirements for corporate disclosure.
Yeah, great questions. And you dished it back, so now I have two questions. So I had to write those down, but I think I'll keep track. So the insurance question is a good one. It comes up all the time. You would think, but there are a couple of factors that I've learned that mitigate the mitigating factors of insurance, if that makes sense. So yeah. One is that many insurance contracts are just they're written for a year, right? So there's always the opportunity to leave or to reprice, and so there's a sense of not my problem. That quickly then rolls up into the reinsurance industry, where you do start to see a lot more activity and action and analysis. And there are several reinsurance companies that I think are pushing the leading edge of this climate risk modeling question, and in getting a much better and more sophisticated look at the economic impacts of climate change. On the question of corporate disclosure, I think, you're starting to see, one interesting example is actually in France with Article 173, where they actually mandated disclosure. And it's been interesting to watch, because that actually kind of in some ways predated the real adoption of TCFD, and seeing how sort of a mandatory regime can dovetail with a voluntary sort of reporting framework. And you're seeing some good examples of companies who have been reporting against a mandate, applying a new framework, where you're starting to see some real useful and actionable and sort of level set data coming out of that. I think another interesting example of that is in California, where there was legislation passed mandating that the public pension funds report on their climate risk in their portfolio, and both STRS and PERS released those reports at the end of last year. They were a step in the right direction. I think it's one of these, you manage what you measure, and just that forcing function of having a mandatory reporting function will set those investment teams on the right course towards developing the capacity to actually identify the climate risk in their portfolio and manage against it. So I think there are examples, and there are plenty more, where you just see that exercise of a forcing function on reporting, helping companies and investors help themselves and start to understand their risk and start to manage to mitigate it.
Yeah, I should tell you that I looked at the France 173 in an effort to think whether we could do it in California. I didn't get as far as I would have liked with it, but maybe it's worth revisiting.
Well, I'll tell you, one of my students in my class this past winter wrote an excellent paper on it. If you'd like me to send it to you, if you have to do that.
Send it to Kate.
Well, she got it too.
Hey, Alicia, that to follow on from that and take it to the next step, if you will, in terms of using this data for making change. Just thinking about not just shareholder actions in general, but specifically the divestment movement, and that's targeted fossil fuel investment. But I can imagine there's all sorts of ways this data could be used. When you think about how this can be used to actually change policy at the board level within these companies, how do you see it? And you're free to say what you think that the tactics and the effectiveness of the current divestment movement is. I know you're sitting right behind what is soon going to be the subject of it tomorrow and the next day. Yeah.
Well, so there were two questions, I think, in your question.
One, and you're allowed to unpack them. And
yeah, one is sort of how does data roll up into the boardroom and inform decision making, and two is what of divestment. So is that fair characterization?
That's a fair, yes.
So the first question, what is data, how does data inform decision making at the board level? I think, in many ways, I think, and COVID, to draw it back, is a perfect example of that, of, to the extent there had been, real appropriate risk management strategy and anticipation at the management level, rolling up from the board level, I think you would have seen more a more rapid and sustained response from companies in response to COVID-19, and I think various companies have struggled with that, and the same can be true for climate. I think the lessons, some of the lessons that are going to be learned apply nicely, which is shortening and optimizing supply chain. Just suddenly, like you couldn't get things you could get before, and that supply chain management, I think, will serve companies well in climate, with regard to climate. I think that also applaud the efforts of the investors who are part of this Climate Action 100 Plus group. That is, I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but trillions of dollars in assets under management, global network of investors convened by Ceres and other leading NGOs that have mapped out the expectations of the top 100 plus emitters to help themselves on a path to a 2-degree target, or science-based targets. And within their set of asks are a whole bunch of levers that management and board can pull, all of which are better informed and better executed on the basis of good data. For divestment, people have very strong feelings about divestment, and I have spent a lot of time studying it. And served on this New York State Common Retirement Fund's Decarbonization Advisory Panel. I think when it comes to the question of divestment, it's important to zoom out and to see it as a non-binary issue, where it's there's a yes and here, which is in some cases it is absolutely appropriate and called upon to be selling assets. I prefer to think of it as selling rather than divesting, and that's based on underlying data that lets investors know that those assets are mispriced. They're too risky for their value. I do think there is a strong moral argument to be made in the case of divestment, and I think those moral arguments have been well articulated. I was particularly compelled by the Harvard faculty and a document they put together in the consideration of divestment at Harvard. I encourage people to read that. The moral case is strong, but I think for CIOs, that's a tough one. I tend to like to speak their language and like to make the case as from a financial perspective that these are just mispriced assets, they're risky and should be sold. But it's not a universal. There's no one list of companies that's gonna that's widely circulated that's gonna make for a wholesale yard sale of fossil fuel assets. And then I do believe it's also, that a degree of shareholder engagement and activism, like Climate Action 100 Plus, helps put pressure on all ends. I think the other thing that the divestment argument leaves out is the state-owned enterprises. I mean, the vast majority of fossil fuel production and assets are owned by states that aren't subject to this conversation. So it is an important galvanizing focal point for waking people up to the risk of climate change and things that they can do, but it in and of itself isn't going to move the needle in terms of climate risk.
Yeah, no, one part of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks, Alicia. And I just want to say that was quite a presentation and really thoughtful responses. Appreciate you bringing that to this dialogue. So we're going to now move to Michael, who's going to round out our 3 presentations, followed by a bit of dialogue, and then we'll close out. So Michael, you've got big shoes to fill. So
I will. Well, yeah. Well, I will. What I'd like to do is actually just kind of go back to what I feel is a critical next step of how to actually make the case for and then enact a mandatory carbon reporting regime. Basically and fundamentally, universally accessible, complete climate emissions data, I believe, is the next critical step to addressing climate change, because without it, you can't have real full climate accountability. Frankly, the public and policymakers need a carbon accounting requirement for all significant public and private institutions so that individuals and institutions can make informed decisions and take actions to reduce emissions at the scale required to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. First, the movement needs to be able to target scientifically and with precision, to your point, Alicia, and use the best available technologies, including big data analytics. These tools have been used to revolutionize politics and professional sports. Frankly, it's time we put them to use in the public's interest to tackle the climate crisis. An effective global climate regime can't be built without transparency. And to echo Ken's points, public access to climate emissions from enterprises and governments is particularly important. This is aligned with the call of Nobel laureate William Nordhaus for a global climate club with mandatory requirements for entry and membership as a way to address the strategic weaknesses of the current voluntary contributions approach of the global climate negotiations. A bottom line is that enforcement cannot be effective without data, as Ken also knows from a previous experience in the Attorney General's office. The climate pollution, CO2, methane, and other CO2 equivalents are invisible and require complete data reporting to ensure the capture and tracking of all actual emissions. Such reporting requirements must be, by design, public and as of right, and not intermediated. And we only need to look at our experiences with COVID-19, the virus pandemic data, to understand why universal public access should be non-negotiable. And then, to echo points Alicia's made, effective markets will only be built with transparent data regimes. And this, of course, has been highlighted by some of the weaknesses that have been shown in the many existing offset markets, with the lack of transparency as a critical design defect identified by many that has undermined, at least in part, their potential effectiveness and credibility with policymakers and advocates. Organizations that have been focused on and dedicated to measuring, tracking, and reporting carbon emissions have made great strides in the past 30 years. Local governments were amongst the first to take on the challenge in 1990 with the founding of ICLEI, an organization I work for as director of the US office, and others like the R20 and the C40. Engagement with the private sector was led by Ceres, founded in 1989, and carbon footprint reporting was accelerated with the founding of the Carbon Disclosure Project, now CDP, in 2000. These voluntary efforts have moved the disclosure movement and helped advance the global climate conversation with decision makers, mayors, and CEOs, as well as with the international climate negotiators. However, the acceleration of the climate emergency, frankly, has outstripped the efficacy of a voluntary encouragement approach. This is in part because of the limitations inherent in the approach and not the fault of those leaders working to increase voluntary disclosures. Very real pressures have limited and even slowed the voluntary disclosure movement. For example, when the Tea Party movement targeted small and rural city and county councils for their climate efforts that included reporting their climate emissions inventory, had a significant dampening effect in parts of this country. Within the private sector, headwinds exist as well, with patchwork voluntary reporting frameworks leaving open the real or perceived threat from competitors to take the low road and gain market share, and similar pressures from shareholders that want to continue with business as usual. A new approach is required, frankly. This is particularly true in my mind when considering private sector emissions. To achieve a data-based climate accountability regime, we need to move on from the existing approach of voluntary reporting to one that requires full transparency and detailed accounting of carbon emissions from all large private sector sources. And this will be a major challenge. In particular, there has been far too little focus on total private sector emissions outside of the context of the few cap and trade systems that require reporting. And even in those instances, the focus has been on the largest source emitters, not on total private sector emissions. And there's good reason for that, as Ken pointed out, to be able to get to the biggest, fastest, and really make significant reductions. The truth is that many of the world's most profitable corporations do not report their full carbon footprint, and those that do often only partially report certain aspects of their footprint aimed at highlighting their leadership. But neither policymakers nor the public actually know or have access to the full details of the carbon pollution of the largest and most profitable corporations in the world at the moment when the world needs full access to this very information to move decisively with maximum intelligence. Until the likes of the Fortune 1000 can account and report their entire carbon footprint, there is little hope that governments can, on their own, reverse the climate crisis. The central role of having accurate information in a well-functioning market has, of course, been demonstrated across the globe and through a wide range of economic sectors. And to echo Ken's original point, it's quite surprising to look at the carbon economy and realize how little information is available and how difficult it is to access still and act upon. So in that, mindful of that, the achievement of a near-term goal of comprehensive climate emissions reporting will require legislation and nothing short of the implementation of a regulatory framework to ensure that all parties fulfill their responsibilities to the public. Such legislation, at a minimum, needs to require complete disclosure of carbon emissions data from public and large private corporations. This information needs to be communicated in a way that is easily understandable and actionable by the public at large. Most regular folks, and for that matter, many elected officials and policymakers, would have a difficult time parsing the details of a 10K report to the SEC, as would I. Yet that is often the outer limits of reporting requirements when they are enforced. Until we have clear, transparent, and broadly understandable information about climate pollution, we will not be able to act upon this information at the scale required for the times. So when I think about it, I think to be able to achieve such a public right to know that enables consumers and investors to make informed purchasing and investment choices, I believe it's going to take a broad public engagement and broad public action. But with the growing breadth and depth of the climate movement that we're seeing, and particularly with the inspiring leadership of the next generation, I'm very hopeful about the prospects of change, despite the challenges we face. So with that, I would just, essentially, I would love to be able to get your thoughts both on, or maybe you're turning it back to me, but let's wrap up with this discussion on how we go from voluntary to mandatory.
Well, we're definitely not letting you off without asking you questions.
I tried to flip the script right there, even though it's not live. It's
well, the one thing that I learned helping put together the Under 2 Coalition, which is subnationals at the state and provincial level, is that at that level and also at the level of cities, it's quite challenging to figure out what your jurisdictional emissions are across multiple sectors, and what are the protocols, and it's expensive. And so there are some, like California, that California has an obligation under the law to report. Even California has challenges doing that. And it's one of the reasons that I really got more interested in satellites and different sources of information. Given your thesis here that we should legislate this, and you can imagine it might be possible maybe in the US, but In places like, some of the developing jurisdictions, it would be harder. How do we do that? And how do we get there in a way that doesn't take 10 years to get to that data?
Yeah, a great question. And this is something that I grappled with a lot when I was with ICLEI, and then since then kind of trying to think about how to deal with this question of data, because there's real data, and then there's essentially estimated data, and then there's modeled data. And we're talking about real reported and tracked data from these sources. And I think one of the big challenges, if you look at the reporting protocols, with government reporting protocols, there's what governments own and operate, the government operations protocol, and then community scale. Now, community scale includes everything else. What is the trick, and frankly, something that needs to be addressed, is that it is often an estimate based on, for instance, what is reported from the utility on, in general, all the businesses and residences within that jurisdiction. Now, there's a direct way to get to that, but that would require corporate entities within the jurisdiction reporting their total footprint. And I think one of the challenges is the fact that governments are saying this is everything that happens within our jurisdiction, but they actually don't have that direct data from those corporate entities, which are not required to report. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the other piece of it does get to whether it's satellites or other form of sensor technology. When you think about, for instance, transportation, which particularly in California, but it's in a lot of places, that makes up a persistent and really stubborn part of the challenge. And I think that's where there are things you can do legislatively within a jurisdiction. If you have, for instance, DMV started requiring people track how many miles they drove in certain fossil fuel vehicles, that's one way to do it. There are ways where you can use sensor technology to be able to show how much you have traveled in certain types of certain modes. And then, of course, there's point source from mobile point source emissions. And to the extent that satellite data and other types of sensor technology can track that, then that's a way around. I think a lot of those are individual data emissions captures, and those I think are going to take something more than just a mandatory requirement, I think, which works well with large institutions. I think when you talk about individuals, you're going to have to combine with incentives and things that try to get people to participate in self-reporting. It's not an insignificant challenge, Ken, and I do think that this part about requiring corporate entities within the jurisdiction to report would go make a big step forward in that.
Thank you. So Mike, I've got some questions for you too, and it's going to be multi-part. To be so I share, of course, your passion and articulation of the need for mandatory reporting. In the context of corporations, let's just use those for what I'm about to ask. I see some key barriers that need some thinking to get to good remedies. So the first is this liability concern, right? So, what happens if I report now and it turns out I was hiding the ball before and now I'm going to get sued? Mm-hmm. Two is this question of kind of dilution, right? So we're seeing really bold climate targets and pledges, and this is of course true for municipalities and states too. Once you have the kind of mandatory reporting and accountability, you start to, the emperor has no clothes suddenly, and is that going to dilute potentially the ambition around climate mitigation? And then the third is a little more nuanced, but I think of it as kind of this data manipulation or sort of assumption gerrymandering, where you start to see particularly fossil fuel companies who might, put their emissions data out against a science-based target and say things are fine because at the 11th hour we're going to suck this all out and it's all going to work out on the back end with carbon capture sequestration at prices that you've never seen before, at scale you've never seen before, and it's all going to be okay. So how do you think about those three ditches that we could find ourselves in, and how do we stay away from them?
Yeah, no, great questions. And tough ones. Liability concerns, I think, are the way, like, that's both real, legal, financial, but also perceptional, reputational risks. I think that's why you have to have an across the board requirement that levels the market. Essentially, like, everybody is required to report, addresses the danger of you being a first mover or an early actor or a big leader, and then you get whacked for essentially reporting something that somebody else is not reporting. I think that's the only way I can see around it. And I think that's one of the things I'm sure that folks at Ceres and others have struggled with as you try to encourage corporate leadership and others don't report the stuff they're doing and somehow they get away with it. And obviously that there's specific things that should be addressed in legislation that deal with that in terms of, and that would be something of longer conversation. I do think that needs to be addressed as well, the potential for going forward, how you build into legislation the issues around liability for what's happened in the past. Dilution, this question of like the bold, I think in some ways the bold actions, and I think this is kind of a tough one for especially the voluntary climate movement, those of us who've all tried to encourage this kind of thing. And even as I encouraged, like, the governor of California to do great leadership and whatever else, at a certain point, you're right, it becomes the thing that everybody just has to do. And I think when we need to move to that, and I think the question will be then how to encourage the boldest leaders, the biggest losers, the next step on this. I think we have to essentially change the dialogue so that the assumption is, and the presumption is, that everybody has to do this, and what you're bold about and what you get praised for and what you hope people aspire to is, reductions, and then ultimately like whole new ways of doing business and whole new, we're rebuilding a renewable economy within this city or jurisdiction. And I do think we kind of have to move the whole framing forward, if you will. And the third question, I think part of it is just that this is an accountability question, and having third-party auditing, but also enforcement. And frankly, there has to be an agreed upon, within the protocols and standards, like certain things are acceptable and certain things won't cut it, if you will. So I think that it's not enough for some entity to report and then come up with something that is not part of an agreed upon protocol for that. And obviously, therefore, we need to work on those protocols and standards as part of this process.
Thanks, Michael. Those are some good questions. Great questions, hard questions too.
Tough questions.
None of this is easy. Obviously, we haven't. I don't think we sourced. I'm excited to hear some really big thinking, which I think is where we need to go. Right? I mean, I think that, and I think the world right now, what I'm heartened by, is that I see big things happening that do change the way we think and do things. And I've seen people respond to that, and the resiliency of human beings and the sense of kind of community I have been really inspired by. And I do feel like that portends well for us being, bold about what we have right in front of us. So I want to thank you, Alicia and Michael, for the great presentations and the dialogue about how we develop and advance a next-gen climate data accountability and an action movement. We're going to need a big piece of action here. It really opened up some critical lines of inquiry and opportunities for action. So once again, I'd like to thank Stanford's CodeX Center for Legal Informatics and the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at Berkeley Law, and the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance at Stanford for co-hosting this important conversation. Really appreciate your time, guys. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.